Hi friends. This talk is probably one of the longest that I will do in this forum. It's adapted from a presentation I did to mostly local but web-based audience for Spiritual Care Day in late October here in Southern Illinois. It's going back to the early days of our experience in the COVID-19 pandemic. In mid-March, early April, just kind of sharing my experiences. The first few weeks were hectic at work, even though we're in a fairly rural area, and we got ready for this big inrush of COVID patients, and it didn't happen. So the hospital felt a little bit like a ghost town. We were running about 50% of capacity and had canceled most of our outpatient work. So it was a strange time to be here, ready for the pandemic that didn't come, and now it's here in full blast. But we had time to prepare, so we can be grateful for that. I spent a bit of time the first few weeks working with ethics-related concerns. But then there was one evening in those first few weeks that I went home and was just overwhelmed by it all. We were getting all the horrible news from New York, Boston, and Chicago, and I just went into the spiral where I was scared for myself, scared for my family and loved ones, scared for my coworkers, just scared and sad. And I remember thinking that I was glad to live alone because if I got it, I wouldn't be bringing it home to anybody. But I also felt very lonely that night. And I thought of my family members and who wouldn't make it through this. I cried, and I reached out to some friends and family. And I cried some more. Maybe I just needed to cry and get it out. Also, I had recently lost a friend. A friend had died, not of COVID, but next morning I was okay. Some nights are just hard when you live alone, but the next day, at the perfect time, I read an article that several people independently had sent me in the previous week or two. The title was, "That discomfort you're feeling is grief." The thing that you're feeling is grief. The article was written by Scott Baronato for the Harvard Business Review. And I just want to say that it's always appropriate to acknowledge feelings of grief. The article included an extensive interview with a guy by the name of David Kessler, who had worked closely with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Of course, we know her of kind of having written the book on death and dying and grief and loss. And he said, we're feeling a number of different griefs. We feel the world has changed, and it has. We know this is temporary, but it doesn't feel that way. And we realize things will be different. Just as going to the airport is different from how it was before 9/11, things will change, and this is at the point at which they changed. The loss of normalcy, the fear of economic toll, the loss of connection. This is hitting us, and we're grieving. And how more so now, 9 months later, when the COVID cases are skyrocketing across the country. We're grieving collectively. We're not used to this kind of massive collective grief in the air. He went on to talk more specifically about anticipatory grief. Most commonly, we feel anticipatory grief when someone we know, someone we love, is dying. I felt it when my husband was dying of cancer 8 years ago, and I felt it that night in early April. Kessler said, anticipatory grief is that feeling we get about what the future holds when we're uncertain. Usually, it centers on death. Back in the spring, everything felt uncertain. And even today, with the U.S. death toll climbing by many thousands every single day, thousands of individual human lives, it still feels uncertain. Kessler said that anticipatory grief is also more broadly imagined futures. There's a storm coming. There's something bad out there. With a virus, this kind of grief is so confusing for people. Our primitive mind knows that something bad is happening, but you can't see it. It breaks our sense of safety. We're feeling that loss of safety. Altogether, this is new, and we're grieving. To some extent, we are still grieving. Kessler talked about the stages of grief in our context. I expect all of us have said or at least thought some of these things. There's denial, which we say a lot of early on. So what? This virus won't affect us. It's no worse than the flu. There's anger. You're making me stay home and taking away my activities. There's bargaining. Okay, if I social distance for 2 weeks, everything will be better, right? There's sadness. I don't know when this will end. And finally, there's acceptance. This is happening. I have to figure out how to proceed. Acceptance, as you might imagine, is where the power lies. We find control in acceptance. I can wash my hands. I can keep a safe distance. I can learn how to work virtually. I can wear a mask. I read another article more recently that suggested that this thing that we might be feeling is beyond COVID fatigue. It's crisis fatigue due to the relentless barrage of stress-inducing events this year. We've had COVID, and we've had fires and hurricanes, and we've had a political situation that continues to escalate. It's exhausting. When we're dealing with such uncertainty in our worlds, it doesn't really end. Just one thing on top of another, on top of another. And unhealthy anticipatory grief is very much like anxiety. Our minds start spiraling in fear, and we envision the worst-case scenarios. We can't just ignore those images, but we can choose to notice when our minds are spinning and change the direction of our thoughts. Instead of thinking bad things, we can think about the better things, the best things, the better outcomes. And since anticipatory grief is going into the future and imagining the worst, try coming back to the present moment. Many who struggle with anxiety know these tricks. Name 5 things in the room. Breathe. Right now, I am okay. We use our senses and express what we feel. I've known for a long time, of course, that control is an illusion. We have to let go of what we can't control. We can't control our neighbors, our coworkers, our family. We can't control the virus. What I can do is wear a mask, stay 6 feet apart, wash my hands, and when I'm not at work, stay home. Also, be patient with one another. None of us have experienced anything like this pandemic before, on top of everything else that's happened this year. Fear, grief, frustration, it's a lot, even today, 9 months later. So be kind and compassionate to those around you. Think thoughts of loving kindness, even towards those you might want to judge or condemn. Maybe even think loving kindness thoughts to those people. And be gentle with yourself. If we are still or again feeling overwhelmed by anxiety and grief, we can simply name it. This is grief. Say what it is. Say, I'm having a hard time today. Say, I'm feeling sad. Say, I feel like crying. I'm so overwhelmed. Speak the words. Kessler said that it's important that we acknowledge what we go through. One unfortunate byproduct of the self-help movement is we're the first generation to have feelings about our feelings. We tell ourselves things like, I feel sad, but I shouldn't feel that. Other people have it worse. We can and should stop at that first feeling. I feel sad. Let me go for 5 minutes and feel sad. Your work is to feel your sadness and fear and anxiety and anger, whether or not someone else has it worse or is feeling something. If we allow the feelings to happen, they happen in an orderly way, and it empowers us. Then we're not victims. Kessler concludes with this line: "It's absurd to think that we shouldn't feel grief right now. Let yourself feel the grief and keep going." Thank you.